This is the story of a tragedy transformed into a triumph. It's a story that has its beginning in the devastation and desperation that marked the closing stages of the Second World War in Central Europe. And it's a story that ends in renewal, hope, and the fierce determination of a nation to survive whatever history throws at it. This nation is Poland. This is a country that has endured more than its fair share of invasions, insurrections, and internal conflicts since it first came into being around 1,000 years ago. Poland, largely through the accident of geography, has been dealt some bitter blows, but it has always found the strength and courage to continue. Its strategic location on the plains of Central Europe has been a two-edged sword, allowing for periods of great economic prosperity and cultural diversity, but also attracting the attention of envious eyes from across the borders. Poland's capital is Warsaw, and it's held that position since the end of the 16th century. For 3 centuries, Warsaw flourished, becoming one of Europe's most beautiful and fashionable cities. But the 20th century took a dramatic toll on the city. After a brief period of independence after World War I, Poland became the catalyst for another global conflict. On the 1st of September 1939, Adolf Hitler's first step in his obsessive plan for world domination was to clear a route to the east. 1,800,000 German troops poured across the border. And from the east came the troops of the Soviet Union, which, for a short time at the start of the war, were Germany's ally. Poland was quickly overwhelmed. For the next 5 years, it became a bloody battlefield for the world's superpowers. It's hard to rank the sufferings of the nations involved in the Second World War, but Poland paid a particularly heavy price. More than 5.5 million Poles were killed, roughly 16% of the population. In September 1944, a frustrated Hitler decided to systematically destroy what little was left of the country, starting with the capital, Warsaw. A few weeks earlier, a ragged bunch of Polish soldiers, short on everything except courage, and with children barely into their teens among the ranks, attempted an uprising in Warsaw. For a while, this desperate group of freedom fighters succeeded against the odds, reclaiming large parts of the city from the surprised Germans. But it couldn't last, and the Nazis' retaliation was swift and brutal. Heinrich Himmler ordered that the city's entire population be exterminated and no building be left standing. Russian mercenaries and other desperates joined in the slaughter. Within a few days, 40,000 civilians were dead, mostly shot on sight. All remaining residents were driven out and the buildings looted before being mined, torched, and blown up. By the end of 1944, Warsaw, once a city of over 1 million people, with one of the most important historic centers in all of Europe, ceased to exist. It's estimated that 650,000 inhabitants lost their lives, and over 15,000 buildings were either totally destroyed or badly damaged. Hitler had wanted a clean slate, so he could rebuild Warsaw as a grand Germanic city, a testimony to the triumph of the Third Reich. In the Old Town, virtually nothing was left. How do you recover from such absolute and merciless annihilation? From the relative comfort of the 21st century, it's hard fully to appreciate what the Poles who cautiously trickled back into a wintry Warsaw at the start of 1945 were facing. Their capital was a wrecked and empty ruin. And as the German occupying forces finally left, the Russian forces moved in from across the east side of the Vistula River, where they had been waiting since the start of the desperate Warsaw uprising by the Poles. The loss of its capital and the trauma of so many casualties were calculated to wipe Poland off the map. But this was a nation strongly united by its past and determined to have a future. Remarkably, rebuilding began almost immediately. Some of it organized, but much of it by ordinary citizens who just wanted their beloved city back. The first challenge was to remove 20 billion cubic meters of rubble, the first step in a rebuilding program that continues today. One of the men struggling with this monumental task was a young Polish architect called Zbigniew Krachinsky. Despite fearing for his life on many occasions, he'd survived the horrors of the war years in Warsaw, and now, rather than looking back, he wanted to look forward to a renewed and stronger Poland. He joined with other dedicated patriots ready to help in the dream of restoring Warsaw's Old Town to its former glory. But where would they start? No plans existed, and there had been no effort to comprehensively document what now lay in shattered ruins. After all, it was the product of around 700 years of history. There was no alternative but to start gathering together as much material as they could find to help them remember what they had lost. Then they began to draw. Zbigniew's son, Mark, is himself an architect and understands the enormity of the task his father and his colleagues took on.
It seemed like an impossible task to rebuild from such a horrendous mess that was here. Now, to build so many buildings from virtually nothing, from the rubble, a whole team of experts had to research and analyze old photos, old drawings, old notes, engineering sketches, and they had to put all this together in the form of working drawings and architectural drawings by the hundreds, if not thousands. This took well over 3 years to prepare all this work.
So an entire historic town was redrawn from as many scraps of visual evidence as the team could track down, making the accuracy of the final reconstruction even more amazing. However, with so many drawings to consult, Zbigniew Krachinsky believed it was critical that the team should see the big picture. So he set about creating one.
Towards the last 6 months of that process, my father decided, look, this has to have some sort of holistic energy. Let's make it all look like one project. We have thousands of these sketches. So he decided to draw a beautiful bird's eye panorama, which was pretty unusual in those days. He was a master at setting up perspectives, so it was a personal mission for him to take this home, and actually in his own time, every spare minute he would work on this perspective for 6 months. And finally, he produced something where the hundreds of buildings are all visible on one drawing, as they would be nowadays if you are flying over in a plane.
Zbigniew's drawing was a remarkable undertaking in its own right. And as well as being critical to the rebuilding of the Old Town, it became inextricably linked to the Krachinsky family's history for the next 50 years. The story of Zbigniew Krachinsky's masterpiece is also one of triumph and tragedy, and it would eventually have a profound influence on the life of Mark Krachinsky. The reconstruction of the Old Town was a slow, measured process as the restorers sought to faithfully follow the plans they had spent so much time painstakingly drawing up. After work each day, volunteers would sort through the hundreds of thousands of bricks in the rubble, selecting the ones that could be reused. They created a brick chain where the good bricks were sorted and relayed to the appropriate building for construction. Building techniques authentic to each period were used, with the result that the Old Town Square looks almost exactly as it did before the war. In fact, it looks almost exactly as it did in the 17th century. Three statues watched over the square before the war. Somehow, they escaped destruction. Appropriately, today they stand in watch like guardians of time over the reconstructed square. Out of the ashes of 1944 has grown a lasting monument to the tenacity, determination, and patriotism of the Polish people. The painstaking reconstruction of Warsaw's Old Town took around 15 years to complete. It's a remarkable achievement, because the original represented over 700 years of development. But what's even more amazing is that the very soul of the city has been faithfully recreated in the meticulous rebuilding of its heart. So much so that the site is now on UNESCO's World Cultural Heritage list. Poland has spent the last 20 years transforming itself into a modern European democracy, subsequently joining both NATO and the European Union, and opening itself up to steadily increasing numbers of visitors eager to experience a culture forged through 1,000 years of history. Warsaw's restored Old Town is one of Poland's premier tourist attractions, not just because of its great beauty and character, but because today it's the place where both visitors and Warsavians come to relax, to commune, to drink, to eat, or merely to sit and watch the passing parade. The square, which once would have been filled with the sounds of busy medieval markets, is now alive to the hum of outdoor restaurants, bars, and people simply enjoying themselves, and appreciative tourists. Some people undoubtedly will understand what it has taken to restore this place, but it's likely many visitors won't appreciate how the absolute destruction and desolation was transformed into an international icon by the determination and dedication of Warsaw's local craftsmen. When the Old Town Square was finished, it was immediately hailed as a huge success. Not only had the team overcome the seemingly insurmountable challenge of creating something out of nothing, it had succeeded in resisting pressure for a quick utilitarian fix. But it was pressure of another kind that would change the Krachinsky family destiny forever. Back in the early 1950s, there were not only the logistical building challenges to overcome, but ideological ones as well. The Soviet Union's grip on Poland extended to the imposition of Stalin's ideas about architecture and social restructuring. The struggle was not just to rebuild Warsaw, but to rebuild it so it retained its original identity. its original character, most importantly, its original spirit. Not all of the rebuilding effort after the war, however, was about restoring Warsaw's grand old houses and palaces. By 1952, Warsaw's population had reached 865,000, bringing an increased demand for new housing. Beyond the city's historic center, the emphasis was on building new housing estates as quickly as possible. The signature Soviet-era influence is evident in the endless lines of concrete apartment blocks. Soviet style also dominates the skyline with the Palace of Culture and Science. Naturally, it was designed by a Russian architect. And not surprising, there's quite a few like it in Moscow from the same era. It was meant to be a gift from the Soviet government to Poland, but the Poles largely ended up paying for it themselves. It's considered something of an eyesore by many and has been described as the nightmare of a drunken cake maker. The imposition of socialist realist ideals of architecture changed the look of Warsaw quite dramatically. But its old heart was faithfully preserved, and so, as a consequence, was its soul. But it wasn't a happy city. Oppression of a different sort was now being imposed by the communist regime. There were restrictions on artistic expression and on freedom of speech. Opposition of any sort was swiftly suppressed. And for Zbigniew Krachinsky, life suddenly took a sinister turn.
My father was asked to spy on all his friends, his huge network of intellectuals, and he found this concept abhorrent and he couldn't do it. He was stripped of his rights, his jobs were taken away from him, and he was threatened for not following the party line. He tried very hard to get official approval to leave, and it was only after many months of using every conceivable friend that he had that he actually was allowed to leave peacefully.
So, in 1959, and with great sadness, Zbigniew Krachinsky left Poland and took his wife and his young son about as far away as was possible, to Australia. Australia was a long way away, but his wife had family in Sydney, so they wouldn't be entirely isolated, and there had been offers of support until they got established. The family knew nothing about their new home, and what's more, none of them spoke much English. For Zbigniew in particular, this was especially hard.
Very tough life choice, and I really sympathize because I know how hard it is for a person who uses language so much in his life to be stripped of this ability to talk to people. For the first 5 to 10 years, he didn't achieve the same level of language in Australia. It was a disaster emotionally.
Australia was so dramatically different from the country they'd left behind. But children are more resilient, and for Mark, it was more like a big adventure.
As a child, it's easier to learn a language, and you adapt more quickly. So I was more fortunate than my parents. There was a bit of discrimination, I must admit, back in 1959, particularly against people from Central and Eastern Europe. And I was seen a little bit as a weird young man because I played the piano instead of playing cricket. At that time, music was a real anchor for me because whilst I couldn't express myself adequately, precisely in English, I could certainly play at a pretty good level. So it gave me a feeling of self-worth. It gave me confidence, whereas otherwise I might have been far less able to connect with other people around me.
The young Mark showed great promise as a musician and finally won entry to Sydney's Conservatorium of Music, where he studied the piano for 5 more years and enjoyed some early success as a performer. But he could already see it was going to be hard to make a living.
There just wasn't enough interest in classical music at the time in Sydney, and people in senior years were having great difficulty earning enough to support themselves in a very basic way. So I had to make the very difficult choice. Do I stay as an artist and a pauper, or do I change careers? My father actually warned me not to do architecture because he said it's from the frying pan into the fire. You know, from one artistic profession into a very difficult, similar profession. And for that reason, partly, I went to architecture, and I think he must have known that I would be contrary and I would go against his wishes. So he may have said this to me. Probably that was his intention. So I went and did architecture, and it was a good choice.
It was a very good choice indeed. At that time, a prosperous Australia was heading into a building boom, and Mark's talents soon netted him some of the most prestigious projects in the country.
When I ended up doing the Australian Museum and the Sydney Opera House rebuilding, I was convinced that I had done the right choice, and things went from good to better to best.
One of the most important cultural undertakings in Australian history, the Sydney Opera House, with its dramatic white sails, became instantly recognised around the world. It was almost too successful, and it was being loved to death.
So after 15 years of very intensive use, it needed a major revamp, and it was on the point of collapse in some areas because it was standing in salt water. They also needed to expand it by 50% in its volume, so we had to build underwater. So we had a large budget to save the building, expand it and improve it and renovate it. 600 projects, very exciting work, the most complicated logistically I've ever imagined. And I was looking after most of those projects with a team of highly trained individuals. We managed to do 500 of these projects in 3 years, and I'm very proud of that.
Despite his struggles with English, Zbigniew Krachinsky was making good progress in Australia. He was now known simply as Bill in his new home. However, Poland was always in his thoughts. His vision was to build a grand home in Sydney that would showcase all his architectural talents, but more importantly, was also to be a showcase for the culture of his beloved Poland. Zbigniew put everything he had into the house, which was completed in 1981 and later won a design award.
Well, the house was the crowning glory of my father's career. It takes a while to get financially established when you come from a new country with nothing. So after 25 years, when my father could build that house, he put in every last penny into it. And he made a very grand residence out of it because the intention was to use it as a cultural center showing Polish cultural artifacts, paintings, drawings, sculptures. Have concerts there. 100 people sitting in the lounge room is not something you can do in most homes, but that's the way my father planned it. So the home had amazing emotional significance for me because he had done something so grand as the last thing he did in his life.
But Zbigniew Krachinsky's vision for a Polish cultural centre in Sydney was not to be realised. Once again, fate would intervene in an entirely unpredicted way. A centrepiece of Zbigniew's cultural centre was to be his drawing of the Warsaw Old Town restoration. All the necessary arrangements were finally made and permissions obtained for the drawing to be taken out of Poland and taken all the way to Australia. Zbigniew then returned to Poland for the first time since he had left, 25 years earlier, to collect the precious artwork. Perhaps it's an indication of just what an emotional experience this was, but as he arrived back in Sydney, Zbigniew suffered a fatal heart attack while getting off the aircraft, with the drawing in its sealed tube still grasped tightly in his hands. After lingering for 8 days, he died in hospital in Sydney. The drawing was placed into storage and largely forgotten for 2 decades.
I only saw the original of this huge drawing back in Sydney in the year 2004, when my mother was on her deathbed. She had asked me to bring it back to Warsaw because she felt it was appropriate. It had been in a sealed container for those 20 years since my father passed away when he brought it from Poland. it just seemed appropriate that now that my family were gone, the drawing should come back here. And at first I was anxious how it would be received after all those years. But then I became determined that this is something that Warsaw deserves. This is a way to pay homage to the wonderful team of experts that worked tirelessly with my father for so many years to rebuild this whole old city. And this drawing was a symbol of that huge undertaking, and it had to be brought back here to Warsaw to be in the museum.
Appropriately, 11 of the restored tenements in the Old Town Square housed the Historical Museum of Warsaw, with its extensive collection of recovered items. It's a testimony to the city's immense capacity for survival and renewal. And it's here that Zbigniew Krachinsky's drawing now resides.
Well, it seemed to my mother and to me this was the right place to keep it, because it was the very center of the actual drawing that my father prepared. So it's in the old buildings behind me. There are more than half a dozen buildings that go together to make up the Historical Museum of Warsaw. It was the right place for it to be shown. I also have wonderful conservators who I knew would take care of the drawing. It is very frail after 60 years. So it's in the right place. It will have very good care. We need to do a bit more work on it just to save it for posterity.
Modern Warsaw is a city of 2 million inhabitants, making it Poland's largest. Beyond the Old Town, or Stare Miasto in Polish, with its medieval originals, the city exhibits a rich mixture of architectural styles. Krakowskie Przedmieście, or the Royal Boulevard in English, is one of Warsaw's most beautiful streets, closed to general traffic. With Warsaw's University nearby, it's one of the liveliest areas of the city. It's lined with the palaces and large houses that were once a symbol of Poland's great wealth. Now they mostly house government departments, but at ground level are bars, restaurants, and fashionable shops. The famous Hotel Bristol adds to the grandeur of the Royal Boulevard. First opened in 1901, it was one of the few survivors of the war. It was built on a site owned by the great Polish pianist and composer Ignacy Paderewski, who later became the country's prime minister, and was saved from destruction so its luxuries could be enjoyed by high-ranking German officers who moved in for the duration of the military occupation. They probably also recognized the hotel's strategic value, as even today, its tower provides commanding views of the city. Miraculously, as the withdrawing Germans began systematically blowing up what was left of any significance in Warsaw, the Bristol survived again. An island in a sea of ruins. A little further down the Royal Boulevard is the Church of the Holy Cross, one of the most important places for Poles. It dates back to 1679 and is a prime example of Warsavian church architecture. But what makes it so important is that the heart of the great Polish composer Frédéric Chopin, preserved incidentally in what appears to be cognac, is interred in a nave pillar. As a teenager honing his prodigious musical talent, Chopin played the organ here and stunned congregations with his skills. During the uprising, its interior was almost totally destroyed by fire, and then the 17th century facade was blown up. Fortunately, the urns containing Chopin's heart and that of the Polish Nobel Prize novelist Władysław Reymont had been removed earlier by a music-loving German general. They were handed back as the German retreat began. Considered one of the greatest, if not perhaps the greatest of all composers of piano music, Chopin is also a Polish national treasure. He was born on the 1st of March, 1810, in Żelazowa Wola, a village about 50 kilometers west of Warsaw, which is now dedicated to his memory. Around 10 kilometers to the northwest of Żelazowa Wola is the village of Broków. Here, in its charming little parish church, Chopin was baptized on April the 25th, 1810. The baptismal font is still in place. His parents were married here, too. So this is, in many ways, the place where the story of Chopin's remarkable life really begins. Chopin's parents were essentially working people, but they were educated and informed, and they raised their children well. Later in life, Chopin was noted for his impeccable manners, his integrity, and his great loyalty both to his family and the country of his birth. As it happens, the family didn't stay in Żelazowa Wola very long after Chopin's birth, but this hardly diminishes its significance in the history of music. It survived a great deal, including brutal looting during the Second World War, to give us an insight into the composer's early life. He grew up in Warsaw, here in the Chapsky Palace, where Chopin lived with his family from 1827 until he left Poland in 1830. A drawing room has been reconstructed, and it was in this very apartment that Chopin composed a number of important works, including the concerto in E minor and the one in F minor. Not far from the Chapsky Palace is the Gniński-Ostrogski Palace, which dates from the late 17th century and today houses the Frederick Chopin Museum. Among the museum's extensive collection, which includes many paintings, letters, and original manuscripts, is the grand piano used by Chopin during the last few years of his life. In the beautiful Łazienki Park is a dramatic bronze monument to Chopin, which depicts him sitting under a Mazovian willow tree, seeking inspiration from nature. Mark, being inspired while construction manager at the Sydney Opera House, provides his personally designed Sydney Opera shade to shield the pianists during the Sunday outdoor summer concerts beside Chopin's statue. Chopin's majestic piano music seems most appropriate as you take in the city of Warsaw. The Łazienki Palace is perhaps the grandest bathing pavilion in the world. Although it's also a royal residence, which has become known as the Palace on the Water. Even in the winter months, this is a park worthy of long walks and reflection. Warsaw's a city of palaces and parks, a legacy of the times when Poland was a powerful and influential kingdom. The Old Town's crowning glory, literally, is the magnificent royal castle, which was built at the end of the 16th century after King Zygmunt III decided to move his capital from Krakow to Warsaw. Like everything else in the Old Town, it was completely destroyed during the Second World War. This landmark was a more challenging reconstruction project, which didn't begin until 1971 due to the lack of Soviet support and encouragement. It eventually took 17 years to complete. The restoration is stunning in both its extent and the attention to detail, and among the many breathtaking features are the Canaletto room, with its walls redecorated by the famous 18th century Venetian painter, together with the Grand Ballroom, which also has a wonderful painted ceiling in similar style. In the ballroom are 17 pairs of golden columns, and the decoration is as elaborate as anything to be found in the palaces of France or Italy. Over the centuries, the castle has very much symbolized Poland's triumphs and tragedies. It's where many momentous political events have taken place, and today it's considered symbolic of Polish independence. In the square in front of the castle is a statue of King Zygmunt III, which was originally erected in 1644 by his son. Despite being damaged on quite a few occasions, it's managed to retain its original appearance, and is the oldest secular monument in Warsaw. Another element shared with so many of the great Eastern European cities is a vast number of churches and chapels. Many, of course, have had to be rebuilt. There were 77 churches in central Warsaw before the outbreak of the Second World War. 54 of them were destroyed. Among them was the 19th century Church of St. Alexander, whose style was inspired by Rome's Pantheon. It was built to commemorate Russia's Tsar Alexander I. During the uprising, the church was hit by 9 bombs, which collapsed the dome, the nave, and one of its towers. After much discussion, it was rebuilt without the towers, so it replicated its original appearance. Even more controversially, it was decided to return the 14th century Cathedral of St. John to its original medieval facade rather than the Gothic one, which had been built in the mid-19th century. Passions ran high because this cathedral has played such an important role in Polish history. It was the place of worship for dukes and kings, and the final resting place for many famous Poles, including the last of the Polish monarchs, Stanisław August Poniatowski, who died in 1798. Walking through the Old Town Square, looking at the rows of neat tenements, the surrounding alleyways, the churches and the bridges, it's easy to forget this was all put back together in such a short time, and that it was put back together again almost exactly as it was before.
After all those years, when I see it in its current state, I'm still amazed that it could be done at all. It was just beyond human comprehension. And now when I have a chance to view some of the old footage after the war and see the devastation, it just makes the whole project even more amazing that it could be completed in the 15 to 20 years after the war.
By another twist, the drawing that Mark's father, Zbigniew Krachinsky, had created to help rebuild the old city of Warsaw would, like a map, guide Mark back to the country of his birth. Fulfilling his mother's last wish, Mark had decided to return the drawing to Warsaw, and in doing so had found a strange affinity with Poland and especially Warsaw. He'd been away for 45 years and built a very successful and happy life in Australia, but the new Poland, boldly making its way in modern Europe, inspired him. Like his father immediately after the war, Mark wanted to be a part of Poland's future.
There is so much to do here. I believe that the next 15 years in Poland will be this golden era that we experienced in Australia from about 1970 to the year 2000. I believe that was the best period for Australia. I think we're in the first 5 years of this type of spectacular dynamic evolution here in Poland.
Mark didn't just find a new challenge in Poland, but also a new family. Wife Eva and stepson Kasper have given him a firmer foundation and helped better understand the nuances of Polish society. Resettling in a country he had only known as a child presented Mark Krachinsky with new challenges, especially as the rebuilding program had continued to reshape the country for many years after the family had left.
There's an enormous change. It's at times a bit hard to adapt. Can't remember many of the streets that I saw as a little boy when I came to Warsaw to visit with my parents in the 50s. There's been so much rebuilding, a lot of the streets have disappeared altogether.
But the old square serves as a very tangible link with his father. And for Mark, it has become one of the most important places on earth.
It is the emotional heart of Warsaw. It's just wonderful to see all these people, all this color, all this life, all the enjoyment. My father would have been so proud to see all this.
Seeing his father's labors come to such spectacular fruition, Mark has been motivated also to help Poland, particularly in the development of a cohesive cultural program. He believes his experiences in Australia, especially working on the Sydney Opera House projects, can now benefit his rediscovered homeland.
It was obviously a big expense for a country even as rich as Australia. But it made me realize that paying for an intensive arts and cultural program was important for a country. I know how well it worked in the Opera House. I know what we spent money, it was very cost effective. I would like to transfer some of those skills here in Poland. They have a very rich arts program and cultural program already in place.
Despite being separated by great distance and very disparate histories, Mark Krachinsky believes that Australia and Poland today have quite a bit in common, not the least being a steady growth in confidence. There's a particularly Australian national characteristic that he'd like to see more of in Poland.
Working as a team in Australia is a national skill. We do very well at team sports. We do very well in cultural team activities. I think we could demonstrate some of those skills here in Poland because it is needed here. Teamwork is going to be the next big step for Poland in the maturing process.
Mark Krachinsky is putting great faith in the future of the country of his birth. Despite professing a great love of Australia, he is committed to working here and is enthusiastic about the possibilities of a united and dynamic Poland.
I think there is a very balanced lifestyle in Poland now. We've adopted a lot of the West's features, but we haven't been overwhelmed by them. Poland has not gone too far that way, and I think it has a very balanced approach because there is a great morality and a great modesty here. There is so much cultural and emotional diversity and richness here because it's more accessible than it may be in France or in England. It's all here at the touch of a hand. I guess that's the main selling point about Poland. I have discovered such a treasure trove of possibilities here, and a lot of them do resemble some of my experiences in Australia, and I hope I can gain from these experiences and perhaps instill some of those good qualities that we have in Australia into the culture here, step by step, and that will take a few years. Standing here on top of the wonderful Bristol Hotel in the bell tower, it's an absolute thrill to see Warsaw in all its glory in this beautiful sunshine. The spectacular panorama is such a stark contrast from the devastation after the war. In the 50s, this was almost all in total ruins, and now, look at it, it's just spectacular.
So as Mark's father, Zbigniew Krachinsky, stood among the rubble of the shattered Warsaw, he could never have envisaged quite how things would turn out. And yet, while it didn't happen in the way he planned, everything he dreamt of has eventually come to pass. And perhaps he would be most proud of the son who, despite growing up a world away, has come to share his hopes and aspirations for Poland.
It's something my father could anticipate. He had a vision of this happening one day. Unfortunately, he died prematurely, also doing things for his country, but he will never see this in his life. I hope he can see it from wherever he rests right now.